I want to take you now to lead you into some of the methodological parts of our translation of Lorenzer. And I want to do this by zooming in on something that by rereading it, kind of, I thought was really, it became more important to me the more I read in the Lorenzer. So late in the summary text, of which we sent you some of our translated excerpts, Alfred Lorenzer, in the original, it's on page 84, presents 4 major distinctions between therapeutically applied psychoanalysis and culturally applied psychoanalysis. And you find that kind of 4 pages from the end of the Lorenzer excerpts, where it starts with from the subchapter 8, Therapy and Cultural Analysis. And there he kind of presents 4 major distinctions. And in the following, I'll present these points and use them as small springboards or signposts to point to aspects in our methodology that I think are worth reiterating, worth discussing, especially considering the many ways in which our group and also beyond, like in psychosocial studies, we have been expanding and enriching on psychosocial methods and specifically also the in-depth hermeneutic method. Now, at the beginning of this excerpt, Lorenzer writes, we are now able to draw some conclusions regarding applied psychoanalysis by comparing the therapeutic setting with psychoanalytic in-depth hermeneutical analysis of literature. We could also take all kinds of other cultural artifacts that works. As already elaborated upon in detail, there are 4 distinctions. And now we start. Point 1, and this is all quoting from the text. While the material of therapeutic analysis, the patient's communication, continuously passes by the analyst's ear and is continuously changing, the material of literary analysis is static. It is a text of perhaps hundreds or at least dozens of pages. This static text can be read an unlimited number of times. In fact, it must be read many times. Of course, as said, like he's using literary analysis, it could be analysis of all kinds of cultural artifacts. When Lorenzer said it must be read many times, this kind of this strategy of allegorically opening out the text I find really fascinating. However, it comes with a caveat, and I think that ties in nicely with what Katharina has emphasized about the scenic and the openness of the Dingvorstellung, of the object associations and presentation, as opposed to the word presentation. We have to do this allegorically opening out of the object's meaning without us being able to hope that we'll ever exhaust those meaning potentials. Because the meaning ultimately resides and remains in the interpretation, and it's locked into the object, as Lorenzer writes, and I'll come to this. In this respect, all unconscious matter has the status of what Julian Manley and Wendy Holloway refer to as a hyper object by quoting Timothy Morton. And like I'm playing with this hyper object. I just thought it really sounded like something I should refer to. I know that there's all kinds of difficulties, but let me play with it a little bit. So when Lorenzer insists, again in the text that we translated, that the unconscious is a register of being before and beyond language, I take this to corroborate the principal unobtainability of the thing in question. And I know that Lorenzer was quite ambivalent about it, saying at one point also, like, you know, there's nothing that we cannot catch with language. I think he would, like, he's contradicting himself in a lot of places, also in the text that we translated. So our attempts to reach out to the object, nevertheless, are always only approximations. And this is where, actually, in those approximations, where culture is being produced and reproduced. Hence, in-depth hermeneutics becomes what I call in my chapter in our book, a retarded hermeneutics, and I'm referring to Simon Critchley, or what a colleague of mine calls depthiness hermeneutics. And I know I'm kind of like, I'm really depthiness hermeneutics. It's kind of like it's when you only snorkel, like he uses the metaphor of snorkeling, where like with a snorkel you cannot go down deep without.
What's the word?
Depthiness. So like he called, like we talked about it, and he said, oh, you mean like it's some kind of depthiness hermeneutics. Depthiness, yeah. It's I know, like this is I'm pushing this very much into kind of what is now being called a meta-modern discourse, but I'm fascinated by that. So I'm staying with the principal unobtainability of the object. Okay, number 2, while in therapy, the analyst, and this is a quote again, constantly intervenes and thereby changes the patient's narrative, the text remains unaffected. As reader or interpreter, the literary analyst's role is a completely receptive one. Obviously, it is not a mere passive reception. In one crucial respect, the reader-interpreter is as active as the therapeutic analyst. They must make use of their life experiences in order to unlock the text in a scenic way. Now, again, there's a lot to discuss here. However, what I am struck by most is actually that this comes very, very close to non-psychoanalytic definitions or understandings of hermeneutics. And I think Chettilmon, in the chapter that he gave us to read and we'll discuss tomorrow, like at the beginning of his chapter, he mentions a couple of hermeneutic theorists. I mean, Gadamer can be aligned with it, and like Heidegger has something to do with it, but like definitely Ricoeur. There's a lot here that like modern hermeneutics would also completely sign off on. So especially the making use of one's life experience to bring something to the fore is at the heart of the modern hermeneutic endeavor, and also other aspects of what Lorenzer refers to as the scenic way are entailed in modern hermeneutics. Definitely like to bring one's own associations, a hovering process, perhaps where we depart from other hermeneutics is in the emphasis on countertransference. So this I'm going to take with me into the discussion. So clearly, these coextensions between a psychoanalytic hermeneutics and other kinds of hermeneutics is because modern hermeneutics has been impacted upon by psychoanalysis. Nevertheless, the question remains, what is genuinely different in in-depth hermeneutics? And that is, of course, the focus on the unconscious. However, if the unconscious remains elusive, what do we have left? And I would argue, like, definitely the emphasis on countertransference, on that something, on what, like the question of what does something do to me and what do I do with and to it. So, and this then becomes exacerbated, I think, in point number 3, where Lorenzer writes, both the manifest and the latent meaning of the text are locked in the text and in the current relationship between the text and the reader. This presents literary interpretation with an opportunity that therapeutic analysis lacks. The stability, permanence, and manageability of the text allow for the circle of readers, interpreters, to be broadened infinitely. The group of clinical analysts can only observe in a critical way whether and how the analyst interprets their relationship to the analysand. In the literary interpretation group, however, every participant can and must engage in that process. That I find interesting. Hence, I argue that what is generally different in in-depth hermeneutics can be understood as a combination of 3 things. I would argue we insist in the locked-inness of the meanings of an object, which then brings us, like, takes us to insist on the central importance of the counter-transferential aspects in interpretation. It's always us trying to make sense of something that remains out of reach. And we then principally broaden the group of interpreters. We don't do it alone. So the group context is vital for any unconscious material to arise. However, this brings me to my last point. When Lorenzer writes that every participant can and must engage in the process of interpreting one's relationship with a cultural artifact, I take this to mean that some kind of like embodied subjectivity, some kind of articulation of the relationship between me as an embodied person, as an embodied subject, and the to be interpreted object is of central importance to the whole process. So when in the same subchapter, Lorenzer writes that the function of a hermeneutical understanding of the unconscious, that is usually in clinical psychoanalysis an aspect of the training process of training analysis, that this function is provided by the act of interpreting as a group. This I find really interesting. In a group, every member gets to witness the process of cultural analytical interpretation. So this emphasis of witnessing, I interpret as a clear signal of how important it is that the respective interpretation remains tied to the interpreter, to the respective person's subjectivity uttering it. Because this invites or makes possible for contradictions and conflicts to come to the fore, to arise, because there is something personally at stake. And it is in the conflicts that arise in a group that I see the most fertile ground for something to announce itself that we really, really have been unable to think of, to accept. Hence, in rounding off, again, the quotation, the most significant difference is the following. While therapeutic analysis aims at changes in the analysand, the potential for change of literary analysis lies in the analyst, in the reader-interpreter. And I think that Lorenzer here puts the analyst into the position of the patient. We need to take that seriously. Have that position of the patient and not simply treat it as a kind of ethical ornament with which to embellish our research practices. No, we need to reach where it hurts in our relationship with a given material and with our peers in the group so that something can come into view that has not been acceptable so far. And in this, we always need to trust that the group will survive our attacks and that we will be able and allowed and forgiven to return the next time. Thank you very much.